A rich man mocked the soup kitchen. Then a veteran handed him a photo that revealed the silver spoon had never touched anything but fine china, yet here it was, trembling in Marcus Wellington's manicured hand as he stared at a faded photograph that would shatter everything he thought he knew about success, dignity, and the thin line between compassion and cruelty. The fluorescent lights of the downtown soup kitchen buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces that had seen too much hardship, while Marcus stood frozen, realizing that some truths arrive not as whispers, but as thunderbolts that split your world in two. It had started as nothing more than a publicity stunt. Another calculated move in Marcus's endless chess game of social climbing and image management. His public relations team had insisted that volunteering at a soup kitchen would soften his reputation after a particularly brutal business deal that had left hundreds of factory workers jobless just before Christmas. The headline had been damaging. Tech mogul prioritizes profits over people. So there he was, wearing a designer sweater that cost more than most of the people in that room earned in a month, holding a ladle like it was a foreign object, his face arranged in what he imagined was a compassionate expression, but was really just thinly veiled disgust. The smell of industrial-strength soup and unwashed bodies made him want to recoil, but the cameras were rolling, and Marcus Wellington never missed an opportunity to control his narrative. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that we're all more connected than we think. Now let's continue with what happened next. The people shuffling through the line barely looked at him, their eyes downcast, focused only on the promise of a warm meal and perhaps a moment of rest from the relentless grind of survival. Marcus forced himself to smile as he mechanically spooned watery vegetable soup into their bowls. But inside, his thoughts were running a different narrative entirely. He couldn't understand how people ended up like this. Couldn't comprehend how someone could fall so far that they needed charity just to eat. In his world, success was a choice. Poverty was a failure of ambition. And people who ended up in places like this had simply made bad decisions. He'd built his fortune from a modest inheritance, sure, but he'd multiplied it through intelligence and ruthlessness. And he genuinely believed that anyone with enough determination could do the same. That's when he made the comment that would change everything. A younger man, probably in his 30s, wearing a threadbare military jacket covered in patches, approached the serving line. His face was weathered beyond his years, deep lines carved around eyes that had seen things no recruiting poster ever mentioned. Marcus noticed the jacket, noticed the patches, and something cruel and small inside him couldn't resist. He leaned toward his PR assistant and said, loud enough for several people to hear, that if people spent as much time looking for real jobs as they did looking for handouts, maybe they wouldn't need places like this. He'd added with a smirk that never reached his eyes, that he'd served his country too. Served it by building companies and creating wealth, which was apparently more than some people in uniform had managed to do with their lives. The room didn't erupt in anger. Instead, something worse happened. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the space, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than any shouting match ever could. The veteran stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his tray balanced in hands that Marcus now noticed were scarred and trembling slightly. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and Marcus felt the first flutter of unease in his chest, a sensation so foreign to him that he almost didn't recognize it as shame trying to take root. The veteran slowly set his tray down on a nearby table and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Marcus tensed, suddenly aware of how many cameras were still rolling, how this could look, what narrative might emerge. But the man pulled out not a weapon, but a worn leather wallet, the kind that had clearly been carried through more miles and circumstances than most people experience in a lifetime. From it he extracted a photograph, its edges soft with age and handling. The colors faded to that particular vintage quality that speaks of decades past. He walked directly to Marcus, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the other volunteers who had frozen in place, and held out the photograph with a steady hand that somehow made Marcus's own hands feel more unsteady in comparison. Marcus took the photo, not sure what else to do, and looked down at it. The image showed two young men in military dress uniforms, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the invincible confidence of youth that hasn't yet learned how fragile everything truly is. They stood in front of what looked like a military base, palm trees visible in the background suggesting somewhere tropical, somewhere far from home. Both men looked proud and strong and full of a future that seemed limitless. Marcus studied the photo, not understanding why he was being shown this, not making the connection until the veteran spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried to every corner of that silent room. He said that the man on the left in that photograph was him, 23 years old, fresh out of advanced training, about to deploy to a war zone that would redefine everything he understood about courage, sacrifice, and the price of service. Then he pointed to the man on the right and said that man was Marcus Wellington's father, David Wellington, his battle buddy, his friend, the man who had saved his life when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device that turned their vehicle into a coffin of twisted metal and fire. He explained how Marcus's father had pulled him from the wreckage despite his own injuries, how they'd both been sent home with medals and scars, how they'd promised to stay in touch and support each other no matter what came next. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. His father had died when Marcus was 16, a brain aneurysm that struck without warning, taking a man who had always seemed unbreakable. His father had rarely talked about his military service, deflecting questions with jokes or changing the subject, and Marcus had always assumed it was because nothing particularly notable had happened, that his father's service had been routine and unremarkable. He'd never known about medals, about combat, about saving anyone's life. His mother had packed away all the military memorabilia after the funeral, unable to look at reminders of everything she'd lost, and Marcus had been too absorbed in his own grief and teenage anger to ask questions. The veteran continued, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly running beneath it like a current. He talked about how he and Marcus's father had both struggled after coming home, how the transition from military to civilian life had been harder than any training had prepared them for. He explained that Marcus's father had been lucky. He'd had the family business to return to, had had support structures and financial cushions that softened his landing. But the veteran had returned to nothing, had found that his job had been filled, that his girlfriend had moved on, that the skills he'd learned in the military didn't translate to civilian employment as easily as the recruiters had promised. He'd spiraled, battled demons that wore the faces of friends he'd lost, turned to alcohol to quiet memories that wouldn't stop replaying, and eventually lost everything piece by piece until he'd found himself standing in lines just like this one, accepting charity from strangers because pride couldn't fill an empty stomach. He said that Marcus's father had tried to help, had reached out repeatedly in those early years, offering jobs, offering money, offering support. But the veteran had been too proud, too ashamed, too convinced that accepting help meant admitting defeat. By the time he'd swallowed that pride enough to reach back out, Marcus's father was gone, and with him went the last connection to a time when the veteran's life had held purpose and direction. He'd spent the years since then rebuilding slowly, getting sober, finding small jobs, volunteering at this very soup kitchen, because he'd been on the other side of that serving line and knew how much a warm meal and a kind word could matter when you had nothing else. Marcus looked at the photograph again, really looked at it this time, and saw his father's face smiling back at him with an expression he'd forgotten his father ever wore. He saw the easy camaraderie between these two young men who had no idea what was coming. No idea that one would die relatively young and comfortable, while the other would survive only to spend decades fighting battles that never made the news. Something inside Marcus cracked, not loudly but definitively, like ice breaking beneath unseen pressure. The veteran said he wasn't telling this story to make Marcus feel guilty, that he wasn't looking for an apology or for money or for anything except maybe to offer a perspective that might be valuable. He said that Marcus's father had understood something essential about life and dignity, that he'd never looked down on anyone because he knew how arbitrary and fragile success really was, how quickly circumstances could change, how much of what we call achievement is actually just luck and timing and being born into the right situation at the right time. He said he hoped that some of David Wellington's wisdom had been passed down to his son, because the world needed more people who understood that compassion wasn't weakness and that acknowledging our interconnectedness wasn't socialism or sentiment, but simply recognizing the truth of the human condition. Marcus stood there holding that photograph for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, aware that cameras were capturing every moment of this, aware that his carefully constructed public image was either being destroyed or transformed depending on what he did next. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't think about the optics or the narrative or how to spin this to his advantage. He thought about his father, about the man in this photograph who had apparently been more complex and more compassionate than Marcus had ever known. He thought about how he'd spent his adult life measuring success in stock prices and profit margins, never stopping to question whether he was building anything that actually mattered beyond his own wealth accumulation. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media, would become one of those viral moments that briefly restore people's faith in human capacity for change. Marcus set down the ladle, removed his expensive watch, and handed it to his stunned PR assistant. Then he did something he hadn't done since he was a child, sitting in a church pew next to his mother. He cried. Not performatively, not for the cameras, but genuinely, the tears of a man confronting the vast distance between who he was and who his father had been, between who he'd become and who he might still have time to be. He embraced the veteran, this man who had saved his father's life and who his father had tried to save in return, and he apologized not just for his comment, but for every assumption he'd made about the people who needed places like this. Over the following months, Marcus would transform his approach to business and philanthropy completely. He would establish a foundation specifically supporting veterans' transition to civilian life, would implement policies in his companies that prioritized workers' dignity over marginal profit increases, would volunteer regularly at that soup kitchen without cameras or publicity. The changes weren't immediate or perfect, and he would struggle often with his old instincts toward judgment and superiority, but the photograph remained on his desk as a constant reminder of what his father had understood and what he was still learning. That we are all one tragedy, one illness, one piece of bad luck away from needing the kindness of strangers, and that the measure of a society isn't found in its skyscrapers, but in how it treats those who have fallen and need help rising again.